A few minutes past noon on the 8th of June 1943, a battleship lay at anchor in calm water off the Japanese coast. There was no enemy within 1,000 miles of her. Half an hour earlier, more than 100 teenage cadets had come up her side for a day's tour. Then one of her after magazines detonated and she broke in two. A battleship moored nearby sent a single signal: her name, one word, and a time. After that, silence. Within weeks, the loss had officially never happened. That is one of 5 catastrophes we're going over today. And the last of them may be the most disquieting of all, because there the mystery was never only about what caused the blast. So settle in. Where we're going, facts blur into folklore. The deeper we go, the stranger it becomes. Let's begin. Our stories today begin not with a battle, but with a wildfire. In August of 1983, flame moved across the dry grasslands of southeastern Montana. Several hundred acres of sagebrush and bunchgrass along a low ridge above a river the Lakota called the Greasy Grass. It burned fast, the way late summer prairie fires do, and when the smoke cleared, the ground was black and bare for the first time in more than a century. And that was the strange gift of it, because that ridge was the most argued over piece of ground in the American West. For 107 years, the grass had grown over it undisturbed, hiding whatever was left of the 25th and 26th of June, 1876. Now the cover was gone. The following May, a team of archaeologists walked onto the burned ground with metal detectors spaced about 15 feet apart, moving in slow parallel lines. Picture yourself on that burned ground in the first week of May, 1984. The ash has been rained on and gone grey. There is no cover anywhere. No sage, no bunch grass, just black soil and the shape of the ridges, which is exactly what nobody has been able to see here since the year the battle was fought. You are one of a long line of volunteers walking a slow transect, 15 feet from the person on either side of you, headphones on, the detector coil swinging low in front of your boots. Then the tone in your ears changes. You stop. You do not dig. You push a pin flag into the ground beside the coil, and you keep walking, because that is the rule. Nothing is lifted until its position has been recorded. Behind you, the flags are going in faster than anyone expected. 10, 30, 60. They come out of the dirt an inch or two down. A cartridge case with the firing pin dent still crisp in the primer. A bullet flattened into a coin. A boot nail. A button. And every one of them is the first thing this ground has said in 107 years. In the first hour, they found 110 artifacts. Before they were finished, across 2 seasons and then decades of follow-up survey, they would recover more than 5,000 objects from the field. Cartridge cases, bullets, arrowheads, uniform buttons, boot nails, suspender grips, a coin, and at one point, a finger ring with a fragment of the finger still inside it. This is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and of the strange, patient effort to work out what actually happened in its final hour. Because the mystery here has never been who won. That was settled before the sun went down. The mystery is what happened in the last collapsing minutes of 5 companies of the United States 7th Cavalry, on a slope where every single one of them died, and where the only people who saw it clearly were the ones the country refused, for the better part of a century, to believe. To understand why the ground had to be red like a crime scene, you have to understand how the battle came apart. By the summer of 1876, the northern plains were being closed. Gold had been found in the Black Hills 2 years earlier, in country guaranteed by treaty, and the government's response to the flood of miners was not to remove them, but to order the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne onto agencies by a deadline most of them never heard about, in the depth of winter, when moving camp was impossible. When the deadline passed, the matter was handed to the Army. That is how 3 columns came to be converging on the Yellowstone country that June, and how one of them came to include the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He was 36 years old. He was a lieutenant colonel, not a general, though everyone called him one out of Civil War habit. And on the morning of the 25th, riding down toward a river valley his scouts had been describing to him with growing alarm, he made the decision that would define everything after it. He split the regiment. 3 companies, A, G, and M, about 140 men, went to Major Marcus Reno with orders to cross the river and attack the southern end of the village. 3 more, D, H, and K, roughly 125, went to Captain Frederick Benteen, sent off to the left to scout the bluffs. 1 company stayed back with the pack train and the ammunition, and Custer kept 5 for himself, C, E, F, I, and L. Something in the region of 210 men. Ahead of them, along the west bank, lay the village. The old accounts described it as stretching for miles, an army of warriors waiting in ambush. The reality, reconstructed from Lakota and Cheyenne testimony, was different and in some ways stranger. The camp ran perhaps 1.5 miles long and 1/4 mile deep, something like 1,200 lodges. Estimates of the fighting men in it range from 900 to 2,000. And the honest answer is that nobody knows. What is clear is that they were not waiting. It was an ordinary early summer afternoon. People were bathing in the river. Some were still asleep after a night of dancing. Women were digging turnips on the bench above the camp. Every native account that survives describes the same thing. Not a trap, but a shock. Reno crossed at around 12:30 by his own report and rode down on the southern end of the camp. His charge stalled short of the lodges. He dismounted his men into a skirmish line, then fell back into the timber along the river, then broke for the bluffs on the far bank in a retreat that turned into a rout. Men were pulled off their horses in the water. By the time he reached high ground, he had lost roughly 1/3 of his command. Benteen found him there. The pack train came up, and on that hilltop, the survivors dug in with knives, tin plates, and their bare hands, and held for the rest of the 25th and all through the 26th under fire, in the heat, without water, until 15 men made a run down a ravine to the river with camp kettles, and were later given the Medal of Honor for it. They heard firing to the north, heavy at first, then scattered, then nothing at all. That silence is where the mystery begins, because when the village broke camp on the evening of the 26th and moved off toward the Bighorn Mountains, and when General Terry's column finally came up the valley on the morning of the 27th, the men on the hilltop went looking for the rest of their regiment. They found them 4 miles north, scattered across the ridges and swales above the river. Stripped, swollen after 2 days in the Montana sun, all of them. Every man who rode north with Custer was dead. Roughly 260 to 270 men of the 7th Cavalry died in the battle as a whole, though the exact figure has never been reconciled. Different counts of the same rolls give different totals, and no two contemporary sources agree. Even counting the bodies on that field was uncertain work. Reno's official report says 204 were buried. The two contemporary counts made on and around the ridge came to 197, and then 214. The National Park Service today says only that close to 200 were found. They were buried where they lay, badly, in ground baked hard as brick. Most went under less than a foot of dirt. Which is why, 13 years later, when the army came back to set marble markers over the graves, nobody could reliably find them. The markers were placed in 1890 wherever a rotting stake could still be located. And there are more markers standing on that field today than there were men to put beneath them. So this is the evidentiary problem, stated plainly. No survivors from the command. Bodies buried in haste and moved twice. Markers that are approximate at best. An official record written by men who had not been there. And a set of eyewitnesses, hundreds of them, whose testimony was collected slowly, through interpreters, sometimes decades later, by interviewers who often did not believe what they were being told. For 100 years, that was all anyone had. The Little Bighorn became less a historical event than a painting. A long-haired Custer in buckskin, saber raised, the last man standing in a shrinking ring of blue. Almost none of that image is true. Custer had cut his hair short before the campaign. The regiment carried no sabres at all. They had been left behind to travel light and quiet. And the iconic scene most people picture comes from a lithograph distributed by a brewery in 1896, 20 years after the fact, which hung in saloons across America until it became memory. Which brings us back to the burned ground and the men with metal detectors. The archaeologist leading the work had done something unusual in preparation. He had trained with the State Police Crime Laboratory in forensic firearms identification. The discipline that matches a spent cartridge to the specific weapon that fired it. Every firing pin, every extractor, every breech face leaves marks that are, in effect, unique. Two rifles of the same model, off the same line, leave different signatures, which meant that if you could recover enough brass from a battlefield and match the signatures, you could do something no historian had ever been able to do. You could follow one individual weapon across the ground, not a unit, not an estimate. One gun, moving from position to position, minute by minute. That is what they did. Across the surveys, the field yielded more than 2,300 cartridges, cases and bullets. They represented something like 45 different types of firearm and, by individual signature, at least 371 separate guns. The numbers from Custer's Field alone quietly demolished a century of assumption. There, the analysis identified 134 individual native firearms against 81 soldier weapons, 69 Army Springfields, 62 .44 caliber Henry repeaters, 27 heavy .50 caliber Sharps. For 100 years, native accounts had described being well armed, including with repeating rifles. For 100 years, those accounts had been treated as boasting or as the exaggeration of old men. The brass in the ground said otherwise. A Winchester lever action could put out something in the order of 20 rounds a minute. The Army's single-shot trapdoor Springfield carbine managed 4 to 6. The men on that ridge were not only outnumbered. In the close work, they were outshot. And the other great technical excuse quietly collapsed as well. Generations of writers had blamed the defeat on jammed carbines, soft copper cases swelling in hot chambers, extractors tearing through the rims, men prying at their weapons with knives while warriors closed in. It happened. The archaeology found evidence of it, but extractor failure appeared on only about 2% of the recovered specimens, and roughly the same rate of failure showed up in the warriors' weapons. It was a nuisance. It was not the reason. The scatter told other things too. Army cases clustered in lines along the high ground, the geometry of men deployed in skirmish order and holding position. Native cases lay in the folds, the coulees and the reverse slopes. The pattern of men using the ground, moving in cover, working closer. There were piles of horsebone where troopers had shot their own mounts to lie behind them. And near several marker sites, there were bullets recovered flattened, the deformation of rounds fired into a body at contact range. The wounded being finished where they lay. The artifact trail also corrected the geography of the fight. It supports a cavalry engagement down near the ford at Medicine Tail Coulee, and then a withdrawal under fire back up Deep Coulee toward the high ground at Calhoun Hill. Not a charge into the village. A move toward the river that stopped, turned, and never got across. And here, at last, the physical evidence and the native testimony began to say the same things. The Cheyenne and Lakota accounts had always described a rolling fight. Soldiers pushed and broken in stages, not dying in one heroic knot. They described warriors on the east bank turning the soldiers back before they ever reached the water. They described the moment the line stopped being a line. That last one is written in the ground almost diagrammatically. On the slope below the high point, the bodies lay in clusters, about 20 around Captain Keogh, 10 more on the rise above him, and then a gap, roughly 200 yards with no bodies in it at all. The interval between men who were still mounted and men who were on foot, at the instant that distinction started to matter. One Lakota account, from a man called Red Feather, described Crazy Horse riding between the lines blowing an eagle bone whistle and the warriors rising in the pause after a volley, when the soldiers, with their single-shot carbines, all had to reload at once. It is exactly the vulnerability the cartridge evidence implies. Red Horse, describing the end, said simply that no soldier was taken prisoner, that all of them were killed. And the Northern Cheyenne historian John Stands in Timber, whose own grandfather died in that fight, recorded what the old men had told him about the young warriors who had taken a suicide vow at the dance the night before and rode straight in rather than shoot from cover. Once they came, he said, it did not take long, half an hour perhaps. So, is that the answer? Did the archaeology solve the last hour? Not quite. And the argument that followed is the most interesting part of the whole story. One of the two archaeologists who published on the material read the pattern as a collapse. In his reconstruction, the 5 companies entered the fight in good order, following recognizable tactics, holding together, and then that cohesion came apart suddenly and completely, and the end arrived in terror and disarray rather than in resistance. His phrase was that there was, in effect, no last stand at all. Just men running out of formation and being killed. It is a compelling reading. It is also fiercely disputed, because a great many native witnesses described the opposite. Concentrated, sustained fighting on the final rise, soldiers standing, a hard fight before the end. And critics point out the obvious problem, that using a thin scatter of markers to prove an absence of resistance is unsafe, when the markers themselves were guesswork placed 14 years late. the lead archaeologist himself has always been more careful in public. A running fight rather than a classic last stand, with Custer recognizing very quickly that he was overwhelmed and doing what he could. That is where the field stands. Two readings of the same evidence by serious people still unresolved. And it is not the only one. There is the question of whether Custer's men killed themselves. One influential book argued that many did, and it is true that of 30 native accounts surveyed, 14 make some reference to soldiers taking their own lives. But when a researcher examined the skeletal data recovered from 31 of the dead, only 3 showed gunshot trauma consistent with suicide, while 22 showed evidence of scalping, dismemberment, or mutilation. Her own conclusion was that the true prevalence remains unknown. The sample is small. It excludes most of the dead. It settles nothing. There is Deep Ravine, where Park interpretation has long held that some 28 men of Company E died. But the officer who reburied bodies on the field in 1881 reported finding only 2 or 3 there, and native sources say much the same. Geophysical survey has picked up anomalies consistent with burials. The soil is unstable, and excavation would be destructive. The ground has simply refused to give them up. There is the question of what Custer was doing at the ford. Feint, reconnaissance, or a genuine attempt to cross that was thrown back. Artifacts can show contact and withdrawal. They cannot show intention. Even the question of which companies went down that coulee is still argued between the park's own interpretation and most modern reconstructions. There is the Crow Scout Curly, sent away before the end, whose story changed repeatedly across 50 years, and whom other participants dismissed outright. There is the native death toll, which may be 31 and may be over 130, and which cannot be recovered, because the dead were carried away by their families, and because a single man might be known by several names in several accounts. There is even the timing. No 2 contemporary sources on that field agree to within half an hour. Nobody's watch was synchronized. Reno wrote his official report from memory 10 days later. And there is Custer himself. He was found sitting between 2 of his soldiers, stripped to his socks with 2 gunshot wounds, one to the left temple, one to the left chest. He had not been scalped. Everything beyond that is testimony rather than evidence, and it will stay that way, because his remains were taken east and reburied at West Point, where no archaeologist will ever examine them. Even the most famous survivor of the Little Bighorn turns out to be a story we told ourselves. Comanche, the wounded horse recovered from the field, became a regimental mascot and then a legend, the only living thing to come off that ground. In fact, other cavalry horses survived. The warriors took them. And more to the point, 7 of the regiment's 12 companies came through the battle. Something like 400 men of the 7th Cavalry walked away from the Little Bighorn. There were no survivors only if you decide in advance that the several thousand Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho who were there, and who won, do not count as people who were present. That may be the most useful thing the burned ground gave us. Not an answer, a correction. 100 years of confident narrative, tested against the physical residue of the event itself, and found to be wrong in almost every particular except the outcome. The guns were not what we said. The tactics were not what we said. The image was invented by a brewery. And the accounts we ignored longest turned out to be the ones the evidence supports. But it stops short. It always stops short. The metal in that hillside can tell you where a man stood, what he fired, roughly which direction he faced, and sometimes how the round that killed him arrived. It cannot tell you what he was thinking, or when he stopped believing help was coming, or in what order the 210 of them understood that nobody was going to walk down off that ridge. More than 5,000 objects, 371 identified weapons, nearly 2,000 acres surveyed. It is the most thoroughly examined battlefield in North America, and there is still a gap in it, a little under an hour long, 4 miles north of the men who could hear it happening and could do nothing at all. The grass has grown back over the ridge. It is quiet up there now, and the markers stand in the wind in their scattered, inaccurate clusters, each one naming a place where somebody probably fell. Probably. That word sits over the whole field, because the last minutes of the Little Bighorn were witnessed by hundreds of people, and not one of them was on the side that wrote the history. Story 2. USS Maine. From a Montana ridge where the witnesses were many and the record was written by the people who were not there, we turn now to a harbour where the opposite happened, where there were almost no witnesses at all, and the history was written anyway, at speed, and acted upon before anybody knew whether it was true. It is the story of the USS Maine, a warship that came apart in a foreign port on a warm February night, killing most of the men aboard her in a matter of seconds. A ship that was investigated 4 separate times across 100 years, by boards of officers, by engineers, by an admiral, and finally by computer. 4 investigations, 4 different answers, and a war that had already been fought and won long before the last of them was finished. Let us go back to Havana in the winter of 1898. Cuba had been in revolt against Spain since 1895, the latest chapter in a struggle that had already run, on and off, for 30 years. Spain's response had been a policy called reconcentration, the forced removal of the rural population into fortified towns, where they died of hunger and disease in numbers that ran into the hundreds of thousands. The American press had been reporting it for 2 years. American public feeling was already inflamed. In January of 1898, riots broke out in Havana, Spanish loyalists smashing the offices of newspapers sympathetic to autonomy. Washington grew nervous about American citizens and American property on the island. And so, on the 25th of January, a United States warship steamed into Havana Harbour and took a mooring buoy in the middle of the anchorage. Officially, it was a courtesy call, a friendly visit resumed after years of absence. Nobody involved believed that for a moment. The Spanish authorities received her with elaborate politeness and watched her constantly. Her captain kept a quarter of the crew on watch through every night she lay there. She was called the Maine, and she was already something of an oddity. Her keel had been laid in Brooklyn in 1888, and she had not been commissioned until 1895, 7 years, during which naval architecture had moved on and left her behind. She displaced about 6,700 tons. Her main battery of 4 10-inch guns was mounted in echelon, offset from the centerline, a design idea that was fashionable when she was drawn and obsolete by the time she floated. The Navy's own records file her as a second-class battleship. Other sources of the period called her an armoured cruiser. The truth is that she was a hybrid from a transitional decade, and nobody was entirely sure what to call her. 355 men were on her books. 4 of her officers were ashore that night, which left 351 aboard. They were not the crew most people picture. More than a quarter of them were foreign-born, from something like 14 European countries, almost all of them naturalized or living in the United States and seeking citizenship. About 30 were African American. In 1898, there was no segregation at the enlisted ranks, though there were no black officers. 9 were Japanese nationals, most of them mess attendants. 7 of those 9 would be dead before midnight. The evening of the 15th of February was hot and unusually still. There had been rain earlier. The harbour was flat. Captain Charles Sigsbee was in his cabin, writing a letter home to his wife. At around 9 o'clock, he stopped writing to listen. The marine bugler, a young man named Newton, was sounding taps out across the water, and Sigsbee wrote afterwards that the notes had struck him as singularly beautiful in the oppressive stillness of the night. He noted the thought and went back to his letter. Newton was dead within the half hour. At 20 minutes to 10, Sigsbee later wrote, there came a bursting, rending and crashing roar of immense volume, largely metallic in character. The lights went out. The cabin filled with smoke. He felt the deck lift and then settle wrong. Approximately 5 long tons of powder charges for the 6-inch and 10-inch guns had detonated in the forward part of the ship. The entire forward third of the main, a third of a steel warship, was destroyed outright. The bow section drove down into the harbour mud. What was left burned and settled until only the upper works stood above the water. On deck, in the dark, Sigsbee asked a Marine private named William Anthony what the time had been. The explosion took place at 9:40, sir. The number of men who died that night is one of the first things about the Maine that will not resolve, and it is worth dwelling on because it sets the pattern for everything that follows. The contemporary official figure, published by the Secretary of the Navy later that same year, was 266. That is the number carved into monuments. It is the number the Library of Congress still uses. The Navy's own modern reconstruction gives 260, or possibly 261. 253 killed instantly or drowned. 7 more who died later of wounds, and 1 who died of shock. With the total, depending on where you draw the cutoff in time. A third figure, 268, circulates widely in documentaries and has no good documentary basis at all. So, about 260 men, 2 officers among them. Everyone else enlisted sailors and Marines, most of them asleep in the forward berthing spaces directly above the magazines, which is why so few of them ever surfaced. 94 men lived. Of the 77 who were blown into the water or jumped into it, only 16 were unhurt. Among the survivors was a mess attendant named John Henry Turpin, who would go on to become one of the first African-American master divers in the United States Navy. And here is the first genuinely remarkable thing about this story. The man best placed to blame Spain, the captain, standing on his own wrecked quarterdeck, counting his dead, did not. His telegram that night reported the ship blown up and destroyed, many wounded, and doubtless more killed or drowned. And then he added a sentence that almost nobody remembered afterwards. Public opinion should be suspended until further report. It was not suspended. 2 days later, the New York Journal informed its readers that the warship Maine had been split in 2 by an enemy's infernal machine, and printed technical drawings of a mine wired to the Spanish shore batteries. William Randolph Hearst offered a reward of $50,000 for the conviction of the criminals responsible. Pulitzer's World competed for the same readers with the same certainty. Neither paper had any evidence whatsoever. The evidence was lying under 30-odd feet of harbour water, and nobody had looked at it yet. There is a famous line attached to this moment. The newspaper baron cabling his illustrator in Cuba. "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." It is almost certainly a fabrication. Its only source is a journalist's memoir published 3 years later. The man gave no account of how he could have known. The telegrams have never been found. Hearst denied it, and Spanish censors controlled the Havana cable, so a message like that would very likely have been intercepted and gleefully published. It is a quotation about how the truth gets manufactured, which has itself been manufactured. It belongs in this story for exactly that reason. And here is the second remarkable thing. While all of that was being printed, the theory that would still be argued about in the 21st century had already appeared, quietly 3 days after the explosion, on an inside page. On the 18th of February, the New York Times carried the view of Professor Philip Alger of the Navy's own Bureau of Ordnance. Alger pointed out that no torpedo exploded outside a ship had ever been known to produce the explosion of a magazine within it. He suggested that the cause should be sought inside the Maine herself, and he pointed at the coal bunkers. The accident theory was not invented in 1976 by a revisionist admiral. It was on the table within 72 hours from the Navy's own ordnance expert, and almost nobody wanted to hear it. The first formal investigation convened in Havana on the 21st of February. The United States Naval Court of Inquiry, remembered as the Sampson Board after its president, Captain William Sampson. Consider what they had to work with. The wreck was underwater and would stay underwater. Divers went down into a harbour so filthy that they worked essentially blind, feeling their way over torn plating by hand and reporting what they could make out. There was no possibility of draining the site. There was no possibility of examining the interior. And the board itself consisted of line officers, seamen, not ordnance specialists, not naval architects. Across the entire inquiry, they called only one genuinely technical witness, and his contribution amounted to saying that he could not conceive of how such a thing could happen accidentally. They reported on the 21st of March. Their central physical finding concerned the ship's bottom. At frame 17, they said, the outer bottom plating had been forced upward some 34 feet above its normal position and bent into a reversed V. The after wing of it doubled back on itself. At frame 18, the vertical keel was broken in two, and the flat keel bent into an angle, some 30 feet above where it should have been. That effect, they concluded, could have been produced only by the explosion of a submarine mine situated under the bottom of the ship at about frame 18 and somewhat on the port side. That mine had in turn caused the partial explosion of two or more of the forward magazines. And then, in the finding that everybody would spend the next 4 months ignoring, the court stated that it had been unable to obtain evidence fixing the responsibility for the destruction of the Maine upon any person or persons. A mine, placed by nobody. Evidence for the cause, none whatsoever for the culprit. Spain conducted its own inquiry in parallel, under two officers named Del Peral and de Salas, and transmitted its findings to Washington in the same week. Their conclusion was that the explosion had been produced by an internal cause. Their reasoning was built almost entirely out of absences, and it is more interesting than it sounds. There had been no column of water thrown up, and a mine detonating beneath the hull in shallow harbour water throws up a great deal of water. There had been no movement of the water at all. There was no crater on the harbour bottom, no sign of a torpedo, no cables of the kind an electrically fired mine would need. And then the detail that has stayed with everyone who has ever read the report. Havana harbour was thick with fish. The port pilot said so. After the explosion, not one dead fish came to the surface. The Spanish commissioners were refused access to the wreck. Their report was barely noticed in the American press. What happened next did not wait for anybody. President McKinley transmitted the Sampson report to Congress on the 28th of March, asking for deliberate consideration and expressing his confidence in the sense of justice of the Spanish nation. His war message came on the 11th of April. The joint resolution passed on the 20th. War was declared on the 25th, retroactive to the 21st. 10 weeks from the explosion to the declaration. It is worth being careful here, because the simple version of this story, that yellow journalism stampeded a reluctant country into war, is disputed by historians who have looked at the private papers of the men who actually made the decision and found the yellow press treated there as a nuisance rather than a force. The pressure that mattered came from Cuba itself, from 3 years of atrocity reporting, from a wrecked Spanish colonial economy, from a private letter by the Spanish minister disparaging McKinley that had been stolen and published on the 9th of February, 6 days before the Maine ever exploded. But the document that went to Congress, the one with the official seal on it, was not a Hearst headline. It was the United States Navy's own finding of a mine, a finding its authors themselves could not attribute to anyone. The Maine stayed where she sank for 13 years. Then, in 1910, Congress authorized her removal, and the Army Corps of Engineers did something extraordinary. They built a dam around a shipwreck. 20 interlocking steel cylinders, each 50 feet in diameter, were driven into the harbour clay in a ring around the hull, joined by sheet pilings 75 feet long. The first pile went down in December of 1910. The cofferdam was closed in June of 1911. Then they began to pump, lowering the water in 5-foot stages, 9 days at a time, letting the pressure equalize. And through the autumn of 1911, the Maine came up out of Havana harbour into open air for the first time since the night she died. Mud-caked, torn open along her whole forward length. With 66 of her men still inside her, almost none of whom could be given a name. Stand inside that dam with them as the water goes down. You are below the level of the harbour now. The sea is on the other side of a steel wall a few feet from your shoulder, and you can hear it. The pumps have taken the level down another 5 feet overnight, and then the work stops for days, because the mud has to be given time to settle and the piling time to prove it will hold. What rises out of the water is not a ship. It is a shape. Plating peeled back like the lid of a tin. Frames standing bare against the sky. A section of the bottom lying 30 feet above where a bottom is supposed to be, folded over on itself. The mud comes to your knees, and it smells of 13 years of harbour. Every so often the work stops again, because someone has found something that must be lifted out by hand and carried up the ladders. A boot, a bone, a scrap of blue cloth that has not seen daylight since a hot February night in 1898. You are standing in the only place on Earth where the answer could still be lying. And you have a few weeks. A second board of officers, The Vreeland Board convened on the 10th of November and reported in December. These were qualified engineers standing on and inside the actual wreck in daylight. It remains the only time in history that anybody examined the main properly. Their conclusion is usually reported as a confirmation of 1898. It was nothing of the kind. Yes, they concluded that an external explosion had initiated the destruction. But they found that the deformation at frame 18, the single most quoted piece of evidence in the entire case, the bent keel that the 1898 court had called proof of a mine, had in fact been caused by the magazine explosion itself. They moved the presumed external event further aft to plating in the region of the reserve 6-inch magazine. And they concluded that whatever had detonated out there had been small and of low explosive power, nothing like a Spanish service mine. In other words, the Navy's own second inquiry quietly took apart the reasoning of its first, kept the conclusion, and moved on. And then it disposed of the evidence. The hull was patched, refloated in the early months of 1912, and on the 16th of March, the tug Osceola towed what was left of the main out past the 3-mile limit, with her colours flying and a following of ships behind her. The sea cocks were opened. She went down by the stern in 41 minutes into something like 600 fathoms of water. Everything that could ever have answered the question went with her. Which is why the two modern investigations are not really investigations at all. They are readings. In 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover, the man who built the American nuclear navy, and a person constitutionally incapable of accepting a conclusion he had not checked himself, commissioned a structural engineer and a physicist to go back through the case. They had no new physical evidence. What they had were the ship's plans, the testimony of 1898 and 1911, and above all the photographs taken inside the cofferdam, many of them annotated at the time by the salvage engineer. Their finding was that there was no compelling evidence of an external explosion, and that the most probable cause was a fire in bunker A16, a bituminous coal bunker which shared a common uninsulated steel bulkhead with the forward 6-inch reserve magazine. Spontaneous combustion in coal bunkers was a genuine and well-known hazard of the period. It had very nearly destroyed several warships. Heat conducted through a single sheet of steel is all the mechanism you need. It is a persuasive case. It also has holes that documentaries almost never mention. That bunker had been inspected on the morning of the 15th of February, and its temperature read 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Adjacent bunkers were checked at 7:45 that evening, less than 2 hours before the explosion, with no redness and no smell. The ship's fire alarm system, which was notoriously oversensitive, did not trip, and the main was burning low volatile coal, loaded in November of 1897 and therefore nearly 3 months old, well past the window in which spontaneous heating is most likely. None of which proves there was no fire. It simply means the accident theory has to explain a bunker that was measurably cold that morning. The last investigation came in 1998 for the centenary, when National Geographic commissioned a firm of marine engineers to model both hypotheses on a computer, the first time anyone had applied that kind of analysis to the case. Their conclusion was that it appeared more probable than had previously been concluded that a mine had caused the inward bent bottom structure and the detonation of the magazines. They also found that a coal bunker fire could have generated enough heat to set off the adjacent magazine. And they stated plainly that their own mine finding was not definitive. The magazine ran it as an open question. everyone else ran it as a verdict. And then something happened that tells you more about the state of this mystery than any of the 4 reports. In April of 1998, at a public debate at the United States Naval Academy, the executive vice president of the very firm that had done the modelling stood up and argued against his own company's report. He believed the damage was internal. On the same platform, the structural engineer from Rickover's 1976 team put it as flatly as it can be put. There was no mine under the main. 100 years after the explosion, in a room full of people who had each spent years on the problem, they could not agree. So, where does it stand? Some things are no longer seriously argued. Nobody with a reputation to protect claims Spain did it. No investigation ever produced a shred of evidence of Spanish agency, and Spain had every possible reason to avoid provoking a war it was certain to lose. Nobody serious claims the United States did it either. And the 1898 board's specific finding, the mine beneath Frame 18, was abandoned by the Navy's own engineers in 1911. What remains genuinely open is the simplest question of all: accident or an external charge? And on that, competent engineers were still on opposite sides at the centenary. The Navy's historians say today that the cause remains unsettled. Its own Director of Naval History, speaking in 2023, said that in 125 years, no conclusive evidence had ever been found, described the coal bunker theory as the most likely and plausible explanation, and then immediately noted its weaknesses. That is the honest position, and it is worth understanding why it cannot improve. The question is not open because nobody has looked hard enough. It is open because the 1898 board never saw the wreck dry. The 1911 board saw it once. And everything since 1976, 1998, and anything anyone attempts tomorrow is a rereading of the same fixed set of photographs, plans, and testimony. The object of study was towed out to sea and sunk in 1912. The dead came home in stages. About 166 were disinterred from Havana and reburied at Arlington in December of 1899. The 66 recovered from inside the hull followed in March of 1912. Somewhere around 230 of the Maine's men lie there now, and the overwhelming majority of them are unidentified. Her mainmast stands above them. Her foremast stands at the Naval Academy. The two ends of a ship, 400 miles apart, marking the graves of men who died for a reason that was published, believed, acted upon, and never established. Remember the Maine, the country said, and went to war. But remember what exactly? Not who did it. No one was ever named. Not how it happened. 4 inquiries produced 4 incompatible accounts. Not even how many died. The official number and the modern number have never been reconciled. What survives is the phrase. What survives is a mast on a lawn in Virginia, and a name carved over the bones of men nobody could identify. And somewhere off the Cuban coast, in 600 fathoms of black water, lies the only witness that could have settled it. Put there, deliberately, by the same Navy that spent the next 100 years trying to work out what it had to say. Story 3. The Mutsu Explosion. The Maine was sunk twice, once by whatever killed her, and once by the Navy that owned her, deliberately, in 600 fathoms, taking the answer with her. But at least the question was asked out loud. At least there were 4 inquiries, and newspapers, and 100 years of argument. Now we go to the other side of the world, and to a navy that took a different approach entirely. Because there is a way to lose an answer that is far more complete than sinking the evidence. You can decide that the event itself never happened. This is the story of the battleship Mutsu, and of an explosion that killed more than 1,100 men in the middle of a home anchorage, in full view of the fleet, and was then removed from the record of the war while the war was still going on. To find her, we have to go to the Seto Inland Sea. If you have never seen it, the Inland Sea does not look like a place where a fleet hides. It is a long, sheltered waterway between three of Japan's main islands, scattered with hundreds of small green islands, terraced and forested, with fishing villages tucked into the folds. The water is calm almost all the time. Ferries cross it. In the summer, the haze softens everything until the islands look like ink on wet paper. And in the middle of it, off the coast of Yamaguchi Prefecture, lies an anchorage called Hashirajima. It was chosen for exactly the reasons you would expect. The surrounding islands made a submarine approach effectively impossible. The great naval base at Kure was close by. And so, through the first years of the Pacific War, the heavy units of the combined fleet lay at Hashirajima between operations, grey steel at anchor among the green islands, waiting. The Mutsu had been lying there for months. She was, in her day, one of the most famous warships in the world. Laid down at Yokosuka in 1918, launched in 1920, completed in the autumn of 1921, she was the second of the Nagato class, and the first class in the world to carry 16-inch guns, 8 of them in 4 twin turrets. When the Washington Treaty carved up the world's battle fleets the following year, only 7 ships on Earth were permitted to carry guns of that caliber. 2 of them were Japanese, and Mutsu was one. She, very nearly, was not. At the conference, the American delegation proposed that the newly completed Mutsu be scrapped outright. Japan refused and kept her by agreeing to demilitarize an older dreadnought in exchange. School children had reportedly donated money toward her construction. She was, in the way that certain ships become, a national object. Between 1934 and 1936, she was rebuilt at Yokosuka. Her stern was lengthened, torpedo bulges added, her armor thickened, her 20 old boilers replaced with 10 oil-fired units, and her foremast built up into the towering pagoda silhouette that Japanese battleships are remembered for. And her main turrets were replaced. The originals came off. Remember that. It will matter at the end of this story. Then came the war she was built for, and she barely fought in it. She was at Midway, and at the Eastern Solomons, and in something like 18 months of the most violent naval campaign in history, she fired her main battery in anger essentially once. 4 rounds at an aircraft. She was too slow to keep up with the fast carrier forces. By early 1943, she'd been detached to home waters and reassigned to a training and reserve role, moored at Hashirajima, taking on young men who needed to see what a battleship looked like from the inside. Which is why there were children aboard on the 8th of June. That morning was foggy, visibility down to a few hundred yards, with a fine drizzle that cleared toward midday. At about 11:30, a party from the Tsuchiura Naval Air Group came up her side. Flight trainees of the preparatory course, teenagers most of them, with their instructors aboard for a familiarization day on the famous ship. More than 100 of them. At 11:45, Mutsu began preparing to shift moorings. Nagato was due in at around 1 o'clock and would want the buoy. Lunch was finished. Men were on deck in the grey light, washing mess gear. And then, a few minutes past noon, the ship's own record says 13 minutes past. The battleship moored nearby logged 15. One of Mutsu's after magazines detonated. There was no warning of any kind. A column of smoke went up, brown and reddish-brown, from the after part of the ship. Number 3 turret, a structure weighing something in the region of 360 tons, was thrown bodily into the air, up to something like the height of the bridge. The hull broke in two. The forward section, the great bulk of her, rolled over to starboard and went down almost immediately. The stern section upended and floated, keel to the sky, for hours. Of roughly 1,470 men aboard, 1,121 died. That number is agreed by every source that has ever counted. Around 350 survived. The figure moves between 350 and 353, depending on which complement you start from. Most of the dead did not drown. They were killed by the explosion itself, or trapped in a hull that turned over in less time than it takes to climb one ladder. The men who lived were disproportionately the ones who happened to be topside in the open air after lunch, with their hands in a bucket. Of the 100-odd flight trainees who had come aboard 90 minutes earlier for a look at a battleship, 13 survived. Her captain, Miyoshi Teruhiko, died. So did his executive officer. And then the Imperial Japanese Navy did something that shapes everything we know and everything we do not know about the rest of this story. The battleship moored a few hundred yards away signaled what she had seen. The ship's name, one word, and a time. After that, all further transmissions concerning Mutsu were forbidden. Navigation in the area was banned. A submarine alert went up and was cancelled within the hour when nothing was found, though not before nearby destroyers, badly rattled, dropped depth charges into an empty sea. To understand why the reaction was that immediate, you have to know where this fell in the war. Admiral Yamamoto had been killed over Bougainville on the 18th of April, 7 weeks earlier. The annihilation of the Attu garrison had been announced to the Japanese public on the 29th of May, 10 days earlier. The Navy had absorbed 2 enormous public blows in 6 weeks. It would not add a third. Not the loss of one of the most famous battleships in the country, at anchor, in a home anchorage, without an enemy anywhere near her. So the loss was simply removed. The Kura Guard Force was sent out to collect identifiable wreckage from the water. Mutsu's radio call sign was used periodically to simulate her presence in distant waters. On the 1st of September, she was struck from the Navy list, secretly. Divers sent down to the wreck were told they were surveying Nagato. Mail from the district was restricted to postcards a censor could read at a glance. Fishermen who had seen a battleship break in half in front of them were told to say nothing. Spreading rumors was made punishable. The bodies that washed ashore on Hashirajima were burned on the beach at first. Then, when that proved too visible, they were taken to a small, uninhabited islet nearby and cremated there, out of sight of the villages, with the firewood brought in by naval supply vessels under the same secrecy that hid the ship. The families of 1,100 men continued to receive their pay, and no explanation. When the captain's widow went to the Navy Ministry in Tokyo to ask what had happened to her husband, senior officers sent her away without an answer. The survivors were kept aboard other ships under a gag order and put to work helping to recover the bodies of the men they had served with. Then they were dispersed, to Truk, to Tarawa, to Makin, to Kwajalein, to Saipan, Most of the men sent to Saipan were killed there the following year. It is important to be careful with that last detail, because it is often told as though it were a documented order. The Navy scattering inconvenient witnesses to the most dangerous islands in the Pacific to have them killed. What is well attested is the dispersal and the silence. That it was punishment rather than the routine reassignment of men from a lost ship is an inference, drawn by the people who later collected the stories. It may be right. It is not written down. Meanwhile, in the middle of all that concealment, the Navy was genuinely trying to find out what had happened. A board of inquiry convened on the 9th of June, the day after, chaired by an admiral, and it sat aboard the battleship moored close enough that the explosion had been visible from her own deck. It ran for something between 1 and 2 months. Its papers were never published, and no English translation of them exists. But its work can be reconstructed, and it was serious. The first suspect was the ammunition. Mutsu carried a new and much disliked round, the Type 3 incendiary shrapnel shell, an anti-aircraft munition packed with incendiary elements, roughly 50 rounds per turret. Sailors distrusted it. If anything in that magazine was going to ignite itself, that was the candidate. So the board tested it, and the scale of the test tells you how seriously they took it. At the Navy's proving ground on an island near Curie, they built a full-scale replica of No. 3 turrets magazine at a cost of around 3 million yen, and they detonated and burned and heated shells actually salvaged from Mutsu's own turret inside it. The decisive evidence turned out to be colour. Type 3 incendiary shells burn white. Propellant burns brown or reddish-brown. And the survivors, the men on deck with their hands in a bucket, who had looked up, consistently described brown smoke. Repeated trials could not make the Type 3 shell ignite on its own. The shell was exonerated. It went back into service across the fleet. That left the propellant itself. But the trials established that under normal stowage conditions, the propellant in Mutsu's charges would not ignite below roughly 80 degrees Celsius. And nothing about a magazine at Hashirajima in early June comes anywhere near that. Sabotage by an outside agent was considered and dismissed almost at once. It was a closed anchorage, ringed by islands, guarded in the home islands of Japan. There was no mechanism, which left the board with a fire it could not start, in a magazine that could not have got hot enough aboard a ship no enemy could reach. And so it concluded that the explosion had most likely been caused by human agency, from inside. The specific suspicion, recorded in a Navy Ministry investigator's report, quoted in Japanese accounts ever since, was directed at a petty officer attached to one of the after-turret magazines. There had been a series of thefts aboard. He was believed to have stolen a watch while serving as a sentry corporal, and he knew that on the 8th of June, the guard commander, the magazine chief, and the warrant officers had left the ship for a court-martial hearing at Cure. Interrogations were about to begin. That is the case. It is worth being precise about what kind of case it is. It is motive and opportunity, with no physical evidence at all, arrived at by a board that had already eliminated everything else. Against it stood the ship's magazine security, which was rigorous. Keys held by the officer of the watch, duplicates in the captain's cabin, sentries posted day and night. In favour of it, others pointed out that a turret was left unlocked during the day, and that a man who belonged there could move from turret to handling room to magazine without being challenged. The Japanese summary of the whole matter is blunt, and it is the honest one. Neither the accidental ignition theory nor the deliberate explosion theory obtained conclusive evidence. The truth was not established. There is one more thing worth knowing about why the Navy found that conclusion so easy to reach. It had happened before. In 1912, a magazine fire aboard the armoured cruiser Nishin was officially blamed on the natural deterioration of imported powder. It was later established at court-martial that the fire had been set deliberately by a disgruntled petty officer. The Imperial Japanese Navy had a history of magazine disasters and a history of getting their causes wrong in both directions. And it did what institutions do when they cannot name a cause. It named a person to hold responsible. The commander-in-chief of the fleet to which Mutsu belonged was relieved of his command over the loss and placed on the reserve list the following February. Then the war ended, and the ship stayed on the bottom in 40 meters of water, and nobody spoke about her for a quarter of a century. By one account, the Japanese public was not effectively told what had happened until December of 1945, when an occupation notice broadcast on the radio asked whether anyone could say where and when the battleship Mutsu had sunk. The salvage came later, and it came in pieces. An early attempt in the late 1940s collapsed in litigation after the contractor took more than it had been authorized to take. In 1953, the great gilded chrysanthemum crest was lifted off her bow. And in March of 1970, a Japanese salvage company bought the rights to what remained of her. The conditions were appalling. Roughly a meter of visibility, strong tides, 20 minutes on the bottom before decompression limits called a diver up. Go down with one of them. You leave the surface in warm summer water and lose the light almost at once, because the tide here keeps the silt moving. At 40 meters, it is not black, it is brown. Your lamp gives you a meter, perhaps a little more, and you work by touch as much as by sight. And what you are touching is a battleship, not a wreck shape, a wall, plating, a frame the size of a roof beam. Somewhere above your head, or below it, is the rest of a ship you will never see more than an arm's length of at a time. You have 20 minutes. There is a wire to place and a shackle to make fast, and the tide is already working at your legs. You are also, though nobody says it aloud on the boat, moving around inside a grave with 272 men still in it. Every so often, your glove closes on something that is not steel. Then your time is gone, and you go back up into the sunlight. And above you, the crane begins, very slowly, to take the strain. That July, they tried to lift the entire stern section in one piece with a 1,500-ton floating crane. 8 steel wires, 85 millimeters thick, parted under the load. They raised number 4 turret later that year. In March of 1971, they took the stern in a smaller piece, using 100mm wire for the first time in Japan. In February of 1972, they lifted the bow. Work continued until 1978, by which time about 3/4 of the hull had been recovered. 849 bodies came up with it. 272 men are still inside her. And in September of 1970, when they opened up what had been lifted from the after part of the ship, they found bones, and with them a personal seal, a hanko, carved with a name. It was the name of the petty officer the Navy had suspected in 1943. The Asahi Shimbun printed it on the 13th of September. It is the single most quoted fact in the whole story, and it proves almost nothing. It establishes where a man was standing when the ship blew up. It does not establish what he was doing there, and it certainly does not establish that he set the charge. A man assigned to a magazine being found in the wreckage of that magazine is what you would expect in either version of events, and even that is contested. At least one account states that his remains were never identified at all, that divers recovered 5 bodies from his quarters, and his was not among them. What the wreck did settle was the one thing nobody had seriously doubted. The deformation ran outward from within. There was no torpedo damage, no mine damage, no external attack. Whatever destroyed Mutsu was already aboard her. Today, the pieces are scattered across Japan, and there is one trap in them worth naming. At the Naval School at Etajima stands a 16-inch twin turret, the only surviving main turret of any Japanese battleship in the world. It is Mutsu's. It is also not from the wreck. It is one of her original turrets, removed during the 1930s reconstruction and delivered to the Naval Academy as a gunnery training aid years before she died. A different turret, her wartime replacement, was raised from the seabed in 1970. Both are correctly described as Mutsu's No. 4 turret. Only one of them was ever underwater. Her bow section stands outside a memorial museum on the island of Suo-Oshima, along with an anchor, a propeller, and some of her secondary guns. Inside are personal effects, recreated compartments, and film of the salvage. Gun barrels from her stand at Yokosuka, at Kure, at Tokyo. And on Hashirajima there is a stone. Not a government monument. The islanders paid for it themselves by subscription in 1963 after a typhoon washed the covering off the bones that had been buried on the little island where the pyres had burned. It faces the water where she sank. Every year on the 8th of June, a memorial service is held and the families come. But the record itself never recovered. That is the deepest damage the secrecy did, and it is worth stating plainly. There was no contemporaneous press coverage. There was no independent examination. There was no public testimony, and the inquiry's papers were never released. The wreck lay untouched for 27 years, and the men who had actually been standing on that deck were gagged, scattered across the Pacific, and in large numbers killed on islands they had been sent to afterwards. By the time anyone in Japan was free to ask what had happened to the Mutsu, most of the people who could have answered were dead. The popular history of this disaster was effectively written in 1970, from interviews conducted a quarter of a century late with the salvage cranes working overhead. That is why the sabotage story dominates. It is the version that was collected. It is not necessarily the version that is true. So we are left with this: a battleship destroyed in calm water, in a guarded anchorage, in the middle of her own country, with no enemy within 1,000 miles. A board of inquiry that eliminated every accidental cause it could think of, and then reached for the only explanation left. A suspect who has been dead since the moment in question, who was never tried, never charged, and never able to say a word in his own defense, and whose seal came up out of the mud 27 years later like a signature on a confession nobody wrote. 1,121 men died a few minutes after noon on a foggy day in June, within sight of the shore, in water shallow enough to see the bottom of. And the country they died for spent the next 2 years insisting that nothing had happened at all. Story 4. Exercise Tiger. Mutsu was destroyed without an enemy, and then hidden by decree. a disaster that officially never took place. Our next story is the reverse of it in almost every particular. The enemy was real and came out of the dark at 40 knots. The disaster was reported to the highest levels within hours, and the reason for the silence that followed was not embarrassment. It was the largest secret of the war. But there is one thing the two have in common. Nearly a century later, we still cannot say how many men died. This is the story of Exercise Tiger, a rehearsal that killed more Americans than the landing it was rehearsing. It begins, strangely, not with a battle, but with an eviction. In November of 1943, the people of 8 parishes in the South Hams of Devon were told to leave their homes. Blackawton, Chillington, East Allington, Sherford, Slapton, Stokenham, Strata, Torcross. Villages of stone and slate and thatch on the red soil of the southwest, some of them recorded in the Domesday Book, most of them farmed by the same families for generations. They were given about 6 weeks. Out with them went 6,000 cattle, 12,000 sheep, 10,000 tons of root crops, and every piece of farm machinery that could be moved. Around 3,000 people, 750 families, across an area variously described as 25 square miles or 30,000 acres. Furniture was carried out of houses that had never been empty. Church plate was removed. Some of the older residents had never spent a night outside the parish in their lives. By the 20th of December, the area was clear. Nobody told them why. The reason lay along the beach at Slapton Sands, a long, straight bank of coarse shingle with a freshwater lagoon lying immediately behind it, and small fields and deep lanes rising up beyond that. Somebody at Allied headquarters had looked at aerial photographs of the Normandy coast and then at photographs of Devon, and had seen the resemblance. Slapton was the closest thing in Britain to Utah Beach. So the villagers came out, and the American army moved in, and through the first months of 1944, the beaches of South Devon were shelled, mined, driven over, and stormed by men who had no idea where they were being trained to go. Exercise Tiger was the largest of those rehearsals. Run between the 22nd and 30th of April 1944 under Rear Admiral Don P. Moon, it was the full dress rehearsal for the Utah Beach landings. Some 25,000 men and nearly 3,000 vehicles, principally the 4th Infantry Division and the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, loaded aboard real landing ships and put ashore under real naval gunfire on a real hostile-looking beach. The realism was the point. Men were to be landed wet, under live fire, with live ammunition, into the noise and confusion they would meet 6 weeks later. And on the 27th of April, that realism killed people. The assault was scheduled for 7:30 in the morning. 4 Royal Navy destroyers would put live shells onto the beach ahead of the landing craft, a proper bombardment on the proper timetable. Then the H hour was moved. One of the assault group commanders asked for a delay. Some of his craft were running late. The landing was pushed back 1 hour to 8:30. The change did not reach everybody. Some landing craft went in on the original schedule into a bombardment that had been set for a beach that was supposed to still be empty. Others went in on the new one, 50 minutes after the shelling that was meant to precede them by that same margin. Aerial photographs flown over the area that afternoon show shell craters as far as 2 kilometers inland, far beyond the target areas. The bombardment had not been tight, and it had not been where it was meant to be. How many men died on the beach that morning is genuinely unknown. One declassified radio log refers to 29 casualties. other accounts have proposed figures of 300 or 400. The United States Navy's own historians say the estimates vary wildly, and that Army records do not indicate landing deaths anywhere near the higher numbers. There is a persistent story that soldiers shot each other with live small arms ammunition in the confusion. There is no evidence of anyone being killed by small arms at all. What we can say is that on the 27th of April 1944, on a beach in Devon, American soldiers were shelled by their own side, and nobody has ever been able to establish the cost. That was the first day. The second is the one people remember. In the evening of the 27th, a convoy designated T4 assembled in Lime Bay, the long sweep of open water between Devon and Dorset, east of Slapton, in the approaches to Portland. 8 landing ships, Tank, the flat-bottomed, blunt-bowed, slow-moving vessels that carried the invasion's vehicles. 5 had sailed from Plymouth that morning. 3 more joined from Brixham in the evening. They carried engineers, amphibious truck companies, and quartermaster units, and they were loaded for war. Fueled vehicles, live ammunition, real cargo. They were escorted by 1 small corvette. There should have been 2 escorts. The second, an elderly destroyer named Scimitar, had been holed in a collision the previous day and had gone into Plymouth for repair. The convoy was not told. A replacement destroyer was sailed, but sailed late, and was some 30 miles away when it mattered. And then there was the other failure, the one that decided everything. The convoy's sailing orders contained an error. What appears to have been a typographical mistake meant that the American ships were not guarding the same radio frequency as their British escort. That evening, British coastal radar detected fast surface contacts crossing the channel from the direction of Cherbourg. Warnings were broadcast. The corvette received them. The corvette's commander assumed, reasonably, disastrously, that the Americans had received them too. He did not break radio silence to check. The 8 LSTs steamed on in line ahead through a calm, cold, moonless night, and nobody aboard any of them knew that anything was coming. The contacts were 9 German fast attack craft, Schnellbooter, which the Allies called E-boats, of the 5th and 9th flotillas, out of Cherbourg at around 10 o'clock that evening under Korvettenkapitän Bernd Klug. They were small, wooden-hulled, and very fast, and they had come out looking for the shipping they knew was building up along the south coast. What they found, instead of a defended convoy, was a line of the slowest ships in the fleet, unescorted in any meaningful sense, at a range they could hardly miss. At about 20 past midnight, flares were sighted. At around 10 to 1, torpedoes were fired at 2 of the LSTs and missed. At 1:30, tracer began to come in. At around 2:05, LST 507 was hit amidships into the auxiliary engine room. Fire took hold on the tank deck almost immediately, in a compartment full of fueled vehicles. 10 minutes later, LST 531 was struck by 2 torpedoes. She sank in about 6 minutes. Witnesses described a gigantic orange ball of flame on the water where she had been. At around 2:30, LST 289 was hit in the stern. Her commanding officer's hard turn had spoiled the shot. She stayed afloat, and she made Dartmouth under her own power with 13 of her men dead. By 20 to 3, the E-boats had disengaged and were gone. They had not lost a single boat. And then came the part that killed most of the men who died that night. The water in Lime Bay in late April was around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, a little above 5 degrees Celsius. In water that cold, A fit young man in uniform has perhaps an hour, and then his body stops obeying him. The soldiers aboard those ships had not been issued the Navy's Kapok life jackets. They had a pneumatic belt, an inflatable tube worn around the body, and they had received no training in how to wear it. Worn correctly, under the armpits, it holds a man's head clear of the water. Worn around the waist, as hundreds of them wore it, it becomes a pivot. A soldier going into the sea with a full field pack on his back rotates around that belt, face down, and cannot right himself. The steel helmet made it worse. Men who had survived the torpedo, survived the fire, and survived the jump were turned upside down by their own safety equipment within seconds of hitting the water. The medical officer of LST 507, a young doctor named Eugene Ekstam, went below to check the tank deck as the ship burned. He opened the hatch and found himself looking into a raging inferno that pushed him back. It was impossible to enter. Put yourself on that ladder with him. The ship has no lights. She is settling, and there is a list you can feel through the soles of your boots. You have spent the last minutes on the deck above, working on burns and on men who came out of the sea already grey. And now you are going below, because below is where the rest of your people are. The heat reaches you before the light does. You can feel it coming through the steel as you work the hatch dogs back, and you understand what it means before you have finished turning them. Then the hatch swings, and there is nothing left to decide. Fire from one end of the tank deck to the other, feeding on fuel and ammunition and the vehicles that were chained down that afternoon. It pushes you bodily back up the ladder. You cannot go in. Nobody is going in. And you know there are men on the other side of it. What you are trained to do next is not ambiguous. You reach out and you close it, and you turn the dogs down one by one. So he did what the standing orders required. He dogged the hatches shut, with men on the other side of them, to preserve what was left of the ship's integrity. He was then in the water for more than 2 hours. LST 515 found him at around 6 in the morning. The rescue itself was very nearly not attempted. Motor launches were ordered up and then recalled, because the surviving landing ships were firing into the dark at anything that moved, and it was not safe to approach them. Aboard LST 515, a lieutenant named John Doyle argued with his commander about going back for survivors and, in one of the strangest command decisions of the war, put it to a voice vote of his own crew. They voted to turn around. They found men in the water at first light. 248 bodies were recovered. How many men were lost is the question that has never been settled. The figure most often carved into monuments is 749. 551 Army and 198 Navy. And it comes from Admiral Moon's own report, dated the 29th of April, 2 days after the attack. A second reconstruction, based on the reports of the individual ship commanders, gives 639. A third number, 946, appears on memorials, in books, and on a stage. It is a whole exercise figure, intended to include the beach incident and other losses, and no single official document cleanly supports it. The Navy's own historians say, in as many words, that exactly how many soldiers and sailors were lost that night remains contentious even today. Set against that, one comparison stands out. On the 6th of June, the 4th Infantry Division put some 21,000 men ashore at Utah Beach and lost 197 of them. The rehearsal cost roughly 4 times what the landing did. And in the hours after the attack, the men at headquarters were not primarily counting the dead. They were counting 10 specific officers. 10 men aboard that convoy held bigot clearance, the highest level of overlord secrecy. They knew where the invasion was actually going. If a single one of them had been picked out of the water by a German boat, or if a single set of their papers had gone into the sea and washed ashore in France, the entire invasion plan would have to be assumed compromised, and the largest amphibious operation in history would have to be redesigned or abandoned. Divers went down for bodies. Staff officers checked names against a list. Intelligence watched the German signals traffic for any hint that the enemy had understood what he had just intercepted. All 10 were accounted for, and their papers with them. That is the true reason for the silence, and it is worth separating carefully from the story that grew up around it later. In the immediate aftermath, the blackout was absolute. Survivors were placed in sealed camps and threatened with court-martial if they spoke. At one station hospital inland, the medical staff who received the casualties were confined to the grounds and forbidden to talk to the men they were treating. Doctors were instructed not to ask questions. That lasted about 10 weeks, until the invasion was ashore and the secret no longer existed. In July of 1944, Eisenhower's headquarters issued a press release describing the disaster. It was printed, among other places, in the soldiers' own newspaper, Stars and Stripes. In August, the casualty figures were released alongside the D-Day figures. It appeared in Eisenhower's naval aide's memoir in 1946. It appeared in the United States Army's official history of the cross-channel attack in 1951. It appeared in Morrison's naval history in 1957. The story that Exercise Tiger was covered up for 40 years is not true. What is true is stranger and sadder. It was published, and then nobody read it. There was no memorial on the beach where it happened, no local commemoration, no annual service. A disaster that killed several hundred men vanished not into a vault, but into the sheer volume of what happened next, in a war where the rehearsal for an invasion could not compete with the invasion. It came back into the light because of one man and a piece of scrap metal. In the late 1960s, a former policeman named Ken Small bought a guest house in Torcross, on the shore of that same beach. After a heavy storm in 1969, he began picking up shrapnel, buttons and coins from the shingle. Local fishermen told him there was a tank lying about a mile offshore. He spent years on it. He eventually bought the tank from the United States government for $50, and in May of 1984, he had it raised and set up in the car park at Torcross, where it stands today as the closest thing that beach has to a monument. His book followed in 1988. The timing of that recovery, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, meant it landed in the middle of an enormous wave of commemorative journalism. And the story that got written was not a forgotten disaster remembered. It was a disaster the authorities buried. From that period come the claims that still dominate the popular account: the 40-year cover-up and the mass graves. The mass graves in particular deserve to be laid to rest. The claim traces to a single local woman who said she had seen hundreds of Americans buried in a field, a story she later changed to individual graves. A BBC correspondent eventually asked the farmer who had owned that land and who had lived there all his life. Nobody, he said, was ever buried there. The Army's own records show what actually happened. The dead were interred temporarily in an existing American military plot in early May 1944, and then moved to the American cemetery at Cambridge or repatriated at their family's request. the men never recovered, are named on the wall of the missing there. Dr. Extam himself, the man who had closed those hatches, spent years of his later life running the rumours down and disproving them. Even the tank at Torcross may not belong to this story. At least one historian has stated flatly that it was lost not in Exercise Tiger, but in a different rehearsal a year earlier. And it is a type of Sherman that was not in the convoy's loads. Its plaque says otherwise. Nobody has settled it. As for Admiral Moon, he was received coldly by his fellow commanders afterwards, and in one case with open hostility. He commanded Force U at Utah Beach on D-Day and did it well. He went on to the Mediterranean. And on the 5th of August 1944, aboard his flagship, he took his own life, leaving a note which said, in part, that the mind is gone, that he was sick, so sick. The two ships lie where they went down, off the Devon coast. In recent years, they were surveyed by remotely operated vehicles and formally designated as protected war graves, scheduled monuments on the seabed, the same legal status as a stone circle. And that is where this one rests. It is not a mystery in the way the others are. We know exactly what happened, almost minute by minute. The missing escort, the wrong frequency, the flares at 20 past midnight, the 6 minutes it took LST 531 to go under, the 42-degree water, the belts worn at the waist. The unanswered question is smaller and, in its way, worse. Nobody can tell you how many men died, not because it was hidden, but because a convoy scattered in the dark, and the ships that could have counted their own people had sunk with the rolls aboard, and two competing tallies were written within days of each other by men who each had part of the picture, and the numbers have never been reconciled since. 248 bodies came out of Lime Bay. Somewhere between 400 and 700 more did not. They rehearsed the landing, and the rehearsal took them, and the sea kept most of them. And the only thing anyone has ever been able to say for certain about the men in the water that night is that the last thing they heard was the sound of engines going away. Story 5. Port Chicago. In Lime Bay, the men in the water could not be counted because the ships that carried their names went down with them. Our last story is the opposite. Here, the dead were counted precisely, 320 of them. The Navy knew every name, every rating, every division. What nobody could establish was what killed them. And what happened afterwards is the reason this one has never really been laid to rest. Because when the investigation ended without a cause, the United States Navy still found men to put on trial. They were the survivors. This is the Port Chicago disaster. Follow the water inland from San Francisco Bay, and it narrows into a long tidal reach called Suisun Bay. Brown water, low hills, Tule Marsh, roughly 35 miles northeast of the city. In the summer, the wind comes up the delta in the afternoon and the heat sits over the flats. In 1944, on the southern shore of that reach, stood the Port Chicago Naval Magazine, the principal ammunition transfer point for the entire Pacific War. The system was simple, and it ran without stopping. Freight trains brought ordnance down from the inland depots. Bombs, shells, depth charges, incendiary clusters, smokeless powder, and ran it out onto a wooden pier. There, working parties transferred it by hand and by winch into the holds of merchant ships bound for the fighting. 24 hours a day. 3 8-hour shifts. Every day. Every enlisted man doing the loading was African American. Every officer above them was white. At the time of the explosion, the station held roughly 1,430 black enlisted sailors, 71 white officers, and a little over 100 white Marines. Almost all of the enlisted men had volunteered for the Navy, hoping to go to sea. They had been sent here instead, to the docks, because in 1944, the United States Navy did not put black sailors on warships in any role but the mess hall. None of them had been trained to handle explosives. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the finding of the Navy's own inquiry. The instruction was informal, passed hand to hand on the job. The officers supervising them had themselves picked up what they knew at another depot in much the same way. Written ordnance handling instructions had been published in 1943. The inquiry found that they were often violated. The bomb casings came in slathered in preservative grease. Men handled them without gloves. Some wrote home asking their families to send work gloves because the Navy did not issue them. Ordnance bounced and collided in transfer. Winches and brakes were run past what they were built for. Men who raised concerns were told not to worry about it. And there was the competition. The station's target was 10 tons per hatch per hour. To keep the tonnage up, the officers ran their divisions against each other and wagered on the outcome. $5 on which division would move the most in a shift. That detail comes to us from a pamphlet written under Thurgood Marshall's direction in 1945, and it might be dismissed as advocacy, except for one thing. Among the formal recommendations of the Navy's own court of inquiry after the explosion is the instruction that the loading of explosives should never be a matter of competition. Institutions do not recommend banning things that were not happening. There was one more thing the men had been told, and it is the detail that sits underneath everything else. They were assured that the ordnance could not detonate, that without fuses installed, the bombs were inert, safe to handle, safe to drop if it came to that. Whether that was true of everything in those holds is disputed to this day. Some accounts describe live, fused incendiary bombs in the cargo. What is certain is what the Navy's own inquiry would eventually list as the single most probable cause of the disaster: a supersensitive element in one of the munitions, detonating during handling. Which is to say, something in that cargo may have been far more dangerous than the men carrying it had been told. On the evening of the 17th of July 1944, two ships lay at the pier. The SS E.A. Bryan was a Liberty ship, 7,200 tons, alongside since the 13th. 4 days of continuous loading had put roughly 4,600 tons of ordnance into her, including some 1,780 tons of high explosives and nearly 200 tons of smokeless powder. Bombs, aerial depth charges, anti-aircraft projectiles, fragmentation, and incendiary clusters. Across the pier from her, on the other side, lay the SS Quinault Victory. She was brand new. She had come alongside at 6 o'clock that evening on her first voyage, and men were working over her booms in the last of the light. They had found the winch whips rigged backwards and were re-reeving them. She was scheduled to begin loading at midnight. She had not taken aboard a single round of ammunition. On the pier itself stood 16 rail cars holding another 429 tons. A Coast Guard fire barge was moored nearby with 5 men aboard. Floodlights over the whole of it. The winches running. Roughly 100 men working the two ships and the pier. At 18 minutes past 10, there was a sharp explosion on the pier. 6 or 7 seconds later, everything else went up. The blast threw a column of fire, smoke, and debris more than 12,000 feet into the air. An Army Air Forces pilot flying over Suisun Bay that night, at 9,000 feet, well below the top of that column, reported white-hot chunks of metal going past his aircraft as big as a house or a garage. Everything within 1,000 feet ceased to exist. The pier, the buildings, the locomotive, the rail cars, a second wharf that was 80% complete. The seismograph at the University of California at Berkeley recorded it as a 3.4. That number sounds small, and it is worth understanding why it is not. A surface explosion couples very poorly into rock, so a shock that annihilates a square mile of waterfront registers modestly on a seismic instrument. It was still the largest man-made explosion the West Coast had ever experienced. Windows broke in San Francisco, 40 miles away. It registered as far off as Nevada. In the town of Port Chicago itself, a mile and a half away, home to about 1,500 people, buildings were wrecked and 109 residents were injured. In Martinez, people described a sheet of white fire crossing the sky, and one man was thrown out of his bed. Be in the barracks for a moment, a mile and a half from the pier. You came off shift and you have been asleep perhaps an hour. The light arrives first, through the window, through your eyelids, white, with no sound attached to it at all. Then the building moves. Glass comes across the floor. The bunk goes over with you still in it, and somewhere above you, the roof gives, and somebody is shouting a name in the dark. You get outside. The sky over the water is lit, as though the sun has come up in the wrong place and at the wrong hour, and things are falling out of it. Hot metal, splintered wood, pieces of rail car, coming down on the roofs and hissing into the mud flats. And the thing you understand is not that there has been an explosion. It is that the shift working the pier tonight is the shift you were on yesterday. That those are the men you ate with. That the lights out there are gone, and the ships are gone, and the pier is gone. There is nothing to run toward. 320 men were killed. Not one of them survived to be treated. Every single person who died was on the ships or on the pier, and all of them died instantly. 10 Navy officers, 231 Navy enlisted men, 1 Marine, 5 Coast Guardsmen, 67 Merchant Marine and Maritime Service personnel, 6 civilians and civil service workers. Of those 320, 202 were African American enlisted ammunition loaders. That is roughly 2/3 of the dead in a single night. And, by the Navy's own reckoning, about 15% of all African American casualties in the entire Second World War. Close to 400 more people were injured. And then there is what was left. Of the 7,200-ton E.A. Bryan, the largest recognizable fragments recovered were about the size of a suitcase. The Kino Victory, the ship that had loaded nothing, was lifted bodily out of the water and torn apart. Her stern came down upside down in the bay, some 500 feet away. The pier was simply gone. Only pilings remain today. Of the 320 dead, 51 bodies could be identified. The other 269 were carried on the rolls as missing. The next morning, 2 miles inland, a farmer walked out into his field and found a 5-inch shell lying in the dirt. The Navy convened its court of inquiry 4 days later, on the 21st of July. It sat for 39 days and heard scores of witnesses, and it could not determine a cause. Its own explanation of why is worth quoting. Because it is honest in a way the rest of the document is not. In an explosion of this magnitude, the court wrote, where substantially all the possible initiating agents were destroyed, it is impossible to determine positively the agent or act which caused the explosion. That is the forensic heart of this story. The thing that started it was inside the blast. There was nothing left to examine. The court listed 6 possibilities in its own order of probability. A supersensitive element in one of the munitions, rough or careless handling by personnel, failure of the handling equipment, winches, booms, slings, brakes, a switch engine striking the rail cars on the pier, an accident involving mooring lines, and sabotage, for which it noted there was no supporting evidence whatsoever. It ruled out explosive vapors from the ship's fuel oil. It ruled out the weather. It ruled out the concentration of personnel. And it never got any closer than that. 80 years later, nobody has. But there is a second reason the investigation could never have found the truth, and it has nothing to do with physics. The judge advocate of that inquiry went on record with the view that African American personnel were neither temperamentally nor intellectually capable of handling high explosives. That was the frame before the first witness was called, and it shows in the record the court produced findings that the enlisted men were unreliable, emotional, lacking the capacity to understand or remember orders, particularly susceptible to mass psychology, that they were poor material for training, that there was a considerable history of rough and careless handling by individuals. At the same time, the court found that the officers had worked loyally, conscientiously, intelligently, and effectively, and that the evidence did not show any intent, fault, negligence, or inefficiency on the part of any person in the naval service. Read those two things together, and you have a document that manages to imply the men caused the explosion while formally finding that nobody was at fault. No individual was ever held responsible for anything. The court recommended that no further proceedings be had in the matter, and then, having found no negligence, it recommended pre-loading inspections of vessels, a standardized loading manual with proper safety standards, blast barricades, fireproof construction, surprise inspections, and an end to competitive loading. It described, point by point, an operation that was systematically unsafe and assigned responsibility for it to no one. There was one more recommendation. Faced with what it had itself identified as a training failure, the court proposed bringing in older, more mature, more experienced black civil service personnel. Its remedy for men who had never been taught was different men. In the days after the explosion, the white survivors of the disaster were granted 30 days of survivor's leave. The black survivors were not. They were put to work clearing the wreckage and the human remains, and then ordered back to loading ammunition. 3 weeks later, at another depot at Mare Island in Vallejo, the 2nd, 4th and 8th Divisions were mustered and ordered to load ammunition again. 258 men refused. They were not refusing to serve. Most of them said they would take any other duty the Navy had. What they would not do was go back to handling explosives under the same officers, in the same conditions, with the same absence of training, 3 weeks after those conditions had killed 200 of their friends. On the 11th of August, Admiral Carlton Wright came down and told them personally that refusal of a direct order in wartime carried the death penalty. 208 men returned to work under that warning. 50 did not. Those 50 were charged with conspiracy to make a mutiny. Their trial opened on the 14th of September 1944 before a panel of 7 officers on an island in San Francisco Bay. It ran 32 days. On the 24th of October, all 50 were convicted. The court's deliberation is one of the most quoted details of the whole affair, and the sources genuinely disagree on it. The best supported figure is 80 minutes, which works out at about 96 seconds per defendant. The National Park Service says 8 minutes. The contemporaneous NAACP account, published the following year, says 45. Whichever is right, 50 men's lives were decided in less than an hour and a half. Thurgood Marshall was there for 12 days of it. He was then chief counsel of the NAACP, not yet a judge, not yet on the Supreme Court, and he was not the defense counsel. The men had Navy-appointed lawyers. He came to watch. At a press conference on the 10th of October, he said that these men were being tried for mutiny solely because of their race and colour. And he said the line that has outlived everyone in the room: "This is not 50 men on trial for mutiny. This is the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy toward Negroes." He also said something quieter and more precise. The men were scared, and rightfully so. They had every reason to refuse to go back to the same conditions that caused the explosion in the first place. In April of 1945, at the request of all 50 defendants, he filed an appeal with the Judge Advocate General. He documented hearsay admitted on something like 40 separate occasions. He noted that the officers giving evidence could not identify which individual sailors they had actually ordered to load. In June, the convictions were upheld. The sentences had begun at 15 years of hard labour with dishonourable discharge and were reduced that November to a range of 8 to 15 years. The 208 who had gone back to work were given bad conduct discharges, suspended, and forfeited 3 months' pay. In January of 1946, under a general amnesty covering some 1,700 imprisoned servicemen, all but 3 of the Port Chicago 50 were released, on condition of a year's probationary sea duty in the Pacific. Afterwards, they received general discharges under honourable conditions. The mutiny convictions stayed on their records. Something else happened too, and it should be said. The Navy quietly abandoned its plan for an all-black loading operation, and the pressure generated by Port Chicago and its trial is credited by historians as one of the forces that made the United States Navy the first American armed service to desegregate. The men who caused that did it by standing still on a dock and saying no. For the rest of the century, the case would not close. In 1994, after 2 years of review prompted by members of Congress, the Navy concluded that racial discrimination had played a part in the assignment of African American sailors to load munitions, and then found that neither racial prejudice nor any other improper factor had tainted the original investigations and trials. The convictions were left standing. One survivor said it was like saying, "It's raining everywhere but right here." That same July, on the 50th anniversary, the site was dedicated as a national memorial. In 1999, President Clinton pardoned Freddie Meeks. He was one of only 3 of the 50 still living. The other 2 declined to seek pardons at all, one of them refusing to ask forgiveness for a crime he had not committed. Which is the point. A pardon is forgiveness. It presumes there was something to forgive. And then, on the 17th of July 2024, 80 years to the day after the explosion, the Secretary of the Navy set aside the convictions of 256 men from both the mutiny trial and the summary courts-martial, and exonerated all of them. The grounds were not sentiment. They were legal, and they were damning. The defendants had been improperly tried jointly, despite conflicting interests. They had been denied a meaningful right to counsel, and they had been tried before the Court of Inquiry's own report was even finalised, a report containing safety findings that would have supported their defence. The men had been convicted of refusing to return to unsafe conditions in a trial held before the Navy's own document describing those conditions as unsafe had been signed. Not one of them lived to hear it. So we are left, at the end, with two mysteries of very different kinds. The first is forensic, and it is permanent. Something on that pier initiated at 18 minutes past 10 on a Monday night in July, and every object that could have told us what it was, the bomb, the winch, the sling, the boxcar, the men who had their hands on it, was inside the fireball. The court said so at the time. 80 years of technology has not changed it. The cause of the Port Chicago disaster is not unknown because it was hidden. It is unknown because it was consumed. The second is not a mystery at all, and never was. It only looked like one for 80 years, because the question of why 320 men were loading live ordnance by hand, at night, at speed, for a wager, without training or gloves or barricades, and why the survivors who refused to go back to it were the only people in the entire episode ever held accountable for anything. That question had an answer the whole time. It just took the United States 8 decades to write it down. 269 of the dead were never recovered. 51 were identified. The pilings of the pier are still standing out in the shallows at Suisun Bay, black and broken off at the waterline, in a line that goes out into the water and stops. And the last thing anyone knows for certain about that night is the time on the seismograph drum at Berkeley. A single sharp line drawn by a needle, 35 miles away, at the precise moment that everything capable of explaining it ceased to exist. Every one of these disasters left a record behind. Testimony taken under oath. Boards of inquiry seated within days. Divers, photographs, salvage, and decades of re-examination by people who came long after. And still, at the center of each of them, there is a space where the cause should be. A grass ridge, a harbour bottom, a quiet anchorage, a stretch of open water, a pier that no longer exists. What survives is the paperwork. What was lost is the answer. Perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about the stories we've followed today. Not that the truth was hidden, though sometimes it was, but that so much of what we call history was built over an absence, and that the men who could have explained any of it were almost always the first to be lost. If you found something here worth thinking about, subscribe and take a look through the rest of the channel. There are many more mysteries waiting in the archive, and we go a little deeper with everyone. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, stay safe.